Hello and welcome to Dr. Keel's Epoxy Magic. In this video, I'm trying my hand at something new, deep pour epoxy. So I've been doing epoxy for about 2 years, and this is the first time I've decided to do a deep pour. And what that means is normally I have been doing basically countertop type epoxy where you do a thin layer over a flat substrate, typically MDF. And you do that for either countertops or tabletops, or you can make wall art with them, different things like that. But this is a little bit different. I'm using a different type of epoxy. This is actually epoxy specifically made for deep pours. A typical countertop epoxy is good up to about 1/8 of an inch. This epoxy is good for about 2 inches. And the reason that's important is because one of the things that happens when you mix epoxy together, you have the part A and the part B, so you have the resin and the hardener, is it's an exothermic reaction. So basically it begins to heat up. And if the chemical structure of the epoxy isn't made specifically for that, if you try to pour it thicker than what it's designed for, the exothermic reaction can cause really strange things. It can cause it to crack, and it just basically doesn't finish well. So in order to do deep pour epoxy, as you can see here, you have to have a mold. And this mold is basically made out of 3/4 inch BCX plywood. And I basically cover all the pieces of the plywood that would be exposed to the epoxy with, this is Lowe's house wrap tape. And the reason you use that is because the epoxy won't stick to it. So it allows you to demold this pretty easily. The other thing you'll notice there is the boards that are going across the two pieces of wood have clamps on them. And underneath them, there are little blocks that are also covered in the plastic tape. And that's because as you're pouring epoxy, which is a liquid, if you didn't have those pieces of wood pressed down, they would actually start floating up. And that kind of defeats the purpose, because what you're trying to do is when you're doing deep pour, whether it be a typical river table or this type of pour here, you're basically filling the epoxy up in the space next to and between the pieces of wood. So these are actually two pieces of cypress that my daughter gave me to do a project, and this is actually going to be a coffee table for her in her new home that she moved into. And initially I was going to cut these in half and do kind of the typical river table thing where you take the cut edge and you put it next to the side. But when I was placing the pieces in the mold, I was moving them around a little bit, and I decided that, just the natural shape of these cross-cut pieces of trunk in this tree were really interesting. And so I decided not to do the typical thing and cut them up the middle. I just set the two pieces in there the way they were, and I just basically am filling it around them. I'm using two different colors of metallic green. One's called Biscay green, the other one's an aqua green. This type of epoxy is mixed at a 2-to-1 ratio by volume. So 2 parts resin and 1 part hardener. And as you can see in the video, basically I'm mixing it up about a gallon at a time. I ended up using about 6 gallons in this. And one of the things you're doing is you're pouring this in, because when you're mixing, you can incorporate air, and so you worry about air bubbles. Now the other thing you have to worry about specifically when you're using wood is that wood traps oxygen, right? And so in order to keep the wood from sucking up the epoxy and also allowing that air to come out and creating a lot of bubbles, you have to seal the exterior of the wood. So what I did prior to this, I didn't show it on the video obviously, is I used a quick coat epoxy and I brushed it on around the entire edge of both pieces of wood. So basically it seals that wood in so it doesn't absorb the epoxy, and also then therefore doesn't release air in or to create bubbles in the epoxy. And I know y'all are really digging the overalls there. So now I've poured in several gallons of the epoxy into the mold, and every time I pour, as you can see, so the goal is these two pieces of wood are roughly about 1 3/4 inches thick, but these are rough sawn pieces of lumber, so they haven't been put through a planer or any other surfacing type device to make them smooth. So some parts of them are a little bit thicker than others. So obviously when you put them in a mold, what you're trying to do is basically you're trying to fill up almost to the very top of the wood. And then what ends up happening is after this, I fill this up, I'm going to torch this, spray a little alcohol on it to create the effects. And what ends up happening is the way this begins to heat up, it creates a bubbling effect. And it's really cool. It makes it look like molten steel or something like that, but basically molten metal, which is I think a pretty neat look. The nice thing is, because again it's a deep pour epoxy, so that effect is all the way through the epoxy. So what's going to happen is I'm going to finish filling this up. I'm going to torch out the top to get rid of any bubbles that have shown up that I've been incorporating from the mixing process. And the way I'm mixing this, I'm using a 5-quart mixing container, and basically I'm measuring out so that I get the same amount of powder. I'm measuring out basically 12.5 grams of the one color, the Biscay green, and 12.5 grams of the aqua green. Putting that into some dispersing fluid, and then mixing in about a gallon of the gallon of the epoxy. So that way each pour is as close to identical as I can make it. And when you're watching on the video, it's kind of cool because as I pour it, then it's basically running around and it's kind of starting to create shapes. And as you kind of keep watching the video, you'll see that it begins to create that bubble effect. So what happens after I finish pouring the epoxy up to almost the very top of the wood, there's a couple areas of the wood where it was kind of like gouged out from whatever they used to cut. Okay, so as you can see, it's another gallon of the mixture going in. And obviously there's a bunch of different ways to do this. Some people are going for kind of a transparent look, and in that case, a lot of times you'll use a dye and maybe 1 or 2 drops of dye to barely color the epoxy so you can kind of see through it. I was going for more of an opaque look, and so I used actually mica powder. And really, it's up to the individual, whatever you think is going to look best for your project. I just kind of thought that the mixture of the 2 colors of the green really contrasted nicely with the grain of this wood. And when we get towards the end of the video, when I show you the actual finished project, hopefully you agree. And obviously I've edited out some of the video. Talking. They're in there on the show. So now I've got my torch, and I'm going to go ahead and torch out the bubbles that are on the surface. Yeah, I'm torching watching the video as the layers of the epoxy are added, you start to see it's creating a bubbling effect. And that's nothing what I did. That's just the epoxy doing itself. So now I've torched it, and now what I'm doing is taking a popsicle stick, going around and basically creating a swirl pattern in the epoxy, and that's further stirring the layers, kind of melting the different layers together. One of the things I love about doing epoxy, whether it's what I've been doing, the countertop epoxy or the epoxy art, or epoxy floors, or in this case now deep pour epoxy, which is kind of the natural progression of doing the different types of epoxy that you can do, is there's no right or necessarily wrong way of doing this. I mean, there are certain things you got to keep in mind. You wouldn't pour countertop epoxy 2 inches thick. You have to use the right kind of epoxy. You want to make sure you mix things consistently. You want your mold to be sealed so the epoxy is not leaking out all over the place. That creates a real problem when you're trying to demold the project. So now I've got that done, what I'm going to do is this is going to set for about 7 days. I'm going to demold it. I have a surface planer. I plane it down smooth, and then I use a saw and cut the edges off to square everything up. And so as you can see here, this is the finished project. And actually what I ended up doing was doing a couple quarts of clear on the top of this because that really brought out the wood grain. So appreciate you watching my video, and hope you have a great day. Thanks.